AWS OpsWorks is a configuration management service that allows you to configure and run applications on AWS. OpsWorks is a configuration as a service. So basically you can maintain your application configuration in source code and have different versions of it. OpsWorks was made specifically to use Chef, which is another configuration management service, but now you also have option for Puppet as well. But for the exam, we'll just focus on the Chef based services of OpsWorks. So if you look at this OpsWorks homepage, here are some of the key features of OpsWorks. First of all, in OpsWorks, your application or your infrastructure is consisting of different layers. So you have a layer of instances, you have a layer of RDS, your layer of load balancers. So you have different layers. So you can configure a simple Linux based an application or a Windows based application or complex applications. And then you can use Chef cookbooks and recipes for your configuration. So if you want to install Apache, Tomcat, configure files, create files, configure software on your instances, you can use Chef cookbooks. For our example, we are going to look at a Chef cookbook and one of the recipes where we'll install Apache on a web server and create an index page. Also, with OpsWorks, you can automate to run at scale, and you can auto scale your instances, and also you can also visualize your application in terms of stacks, layers, and apps, and you can monitor your application. So we are going to look at an example of OpsWorks. So before that, we're going to look at this concept about OpsWorks, and we're going to visualize this. So think about your infrastructure as a stack. So basically you have this OpsWorks stack over here, and a stack consists of layers. So you have a layer of load balancer, you have a layer where you have your application servers. It could be an EC2 instance, or it could be an on-premise instance, or it could be combination of both. And then you have your layer of RDS. So this is your one application. You can have multiple such stacks for different applications. So you need to know when to create different stacks or when you could use an additional layer. So in our case, we have this, let's say, a stack and then different layers. And then you have this concept of cookbook repository where you have a Chef repository, which is a Chef cookbook, which can have multiple recipes. And then you can apply those recipes on the servers. So basically, each recipe will consist of configuration items like install Apache, install Tomcat, and create files, and whatever configuration that you want to do it or do on your server, that would be inside your cookbook repository. And then you apply that on the instances, and whenever the instances are in a OpsWorks layer, it has different life cycles. Like when the instance reboots, there's a lifecycle event, and when there's an instance which is ready, and then there are different life cycles, and we're going to look at different life cycles. So you can apply this cookbooks, and the recipes have different life cycles of an event. So then we have this another concept of an app where you can deploy the app to your instances. So app is basically a construct where you put your code inside an app, and the code could be a Git repository or a zip file in S3, and then you provide it to an app, and then that app gets deployed to the instances. And over here, the cookbook again can be a Git repository or a zip file, which is deployed to your servers. So we're going to look at an example of cookbook repository and how to manage your stack and the layers within the stack. So this is again our basic cookbook that we're going to use for our instances in this demo or in the next video. So these are our recipes. So this is our default.ruby file.rb file, and this is our recipe to install Apache, start Apache, and create an index.html file. So this is a chef recipe, and basically the important sections are here. We are going to install package Apache 2. So if nothing is mentioned, it will assume that we're asking it to install. So it's going to install Apache 2. And basically OpsWorks or Chef works with a concept called state, where it tries to bring an instance into a particular state. So here the state is install Apache, and if there is Apache 2 already on the instance, it won't reinstall it. And then over here it's going to, we have different actions, and one of them is enable Apache and then start Apache. So if it's already started, it won't restart again. And then here it will create an index.html file from the source, which is a template. So we're going to go to our template section of this repository, and this is what it will create at that location. So it will create this file index.html with this contents on this location. So this is a basic recipe, a chef recipe. You don't have to know chef for the exam. You just need to know that there's this concept of chef recipes and cookbooks, which is applied to an instance at different stages of an instance lifecycle. And we're going to look at those lifecycle events as well in another video. So once you have your cookbook ready, you can apply that to your instances, and this repository is available on my GitHub repo. You can go and check this out. So in this video we saw the basics of OpsWorks, what is an OpsWorks stack, and then we saw what is a stack, what are layers, and what is a cookbook repository, and then what is a app. We had a high level overview of you, and we're going to look at an actual example of that as well. So now we are going to see how to create a stack in OpsWorks, and then how to add layers to it. So I'm in my AWS console, and you can look up OpsWorks over here, or you can click the OpsWorks link. So it will bring you to the OpsWorks homepage, and currently we don't have any stacks. So I'm going to click on add your first stack. So we have different options over here. We are going to use Chef's 12 stack. You could also deploy a sample application using the sample OpsWorks stack for Node.js. But we're going to select Chef 12 stack, and we're going to give our stack a name. And I would say web application stack. Then the region which you want your resources to be deployed to, the VPC, default subnet. So I'm going to leave everything as default, so it will be created in default VPC and default subnet. You can either use Linux or Windows. You cannot use both, so I'm going to keep Linux. And Amazon, or we're going to select Ubuntu 16 for this demo. SSH key, I'm going to use my regular SSH key which we had created, so you can use your SSH key. And here's the important option, use chef custom cookbooks, and we are going to select yes, and then we are going to provide our own cookbook. So you can find the cookbook in my GitHub account, where if you go to urbansolanki/OpsWorks demo, you'll be able to find the cookbook over here. And then I'm going to click on this clone and get the git URL for our cookbook. I'm going to paste it over here. We don't require any authentication since it's a public repository, and the branch would be the master. And the other advanced options you could have is, do you want it EBS backed or instant store backed, and we're going to leave EBS backed. And for the role, you can leave the IAM role or default IAM instance profile. If you are trying it for first time, then you can select the new IAM role, and OpsWorks will, or the console will create the new required rules for you. And we have the endpoint. The hostname theme will determine what your instance will be named. So if you do it layer dependent, so it will provide the layer name to your instance name. And you can see the other options available. So I'm going to select layer dependent, so later on we'll give our layer name, and our instances will be named depending on the layer name. And the custom JSON option is if you want to pass a JSON to your chef recipes, you can do that. We're not going to pass anything for this demo. And then we're going to click on add stack. So now this has added a stack for us, and then we are going to add layers to our stack. So let's click on add layer, or you could just go to layers and click on add layer. So here there are different layers available, like there's OpsWorks layer and ECS layer and RDS, and we want to create a web application layer where we will put our web application instances. So our web server layer, and we're going to provide our layer a name, and we're going to call it as web server, and then click on add layer. So now we have our layers added. The another thing that we would need to do is inside our layer, click on recipes. So once you are over here, we are going to configure a recipe. So if you go to my cookbook or our cookbook and go to metadata, here we have the cookbook name. So we are going to use that in the configure section, and then we're going to provide the recipe, and here we have our default recipe. So I'm just going to call it as default. So during the configure stage, it will run the default recipe on the instances. So that's how you provide your recipes to OpsWorks. And we have already seen what our cookbook does and what our recipe does. And we're going to click on save. So we have our recipe configured for our OpsWorks layer. Now let's click on the security tab over here, and we need to add an additional security group over here. So for that, I'm going to click on edit, and then select any of your security groups. Basically we need the security group because we need to access our instance using HTTP, so it's a web page, so you need to have port 80. So I already have a security group, so I'm going to select my web security group. So the security group would be added over here. And if you don't have a security group, you'll have to create one which has access to port 80. And I'm going to click on save. So now let's look at EBS volumes tab, and there are no additional volumes, but if you want to add additional volumes, you can edit and add them here. If you go to network, there's no load balancer in this application, but then you can add a load balancer, but you have to create your load balancer in the EC2 load balancer section and then add the load balancer from here. And we already have seen the configure lifecycle event, and during that we are going to configure Apache and create our HTML page. So now once we have created our layer, we'll go to instances and add an instance to the layer. And as you can see over here, we already have the naming convention that we had selected while creating the stack. And then we can select the size of the instance, and I'm going to go with T2 micro. Subnet will leave it as default, and then you can have some other settings you want for the instance. So the scaling type, we are going to select 24/7. Basically it means that the instance will always stay up. You can have different scaling types as well. And then I'm going to click on add instance. Once that's done, we can click on start, which will basically bring the instance up, and then it will go through the lifecycle events, and we have already configured one of the lifecycle events and which contains installing HTTP, Apache 2, and then creating the HTML page. So once it goes through all the events, our instance will be ready and it will have our configurations done and we'll be able to access our web page. So while our instance is booting, let's look at different other instance types that we can use. So over here I'm going to add an instance, and you can see over here now it's web server 2 depending on naming convention, and we can leave it C3 large for now. And in the advanced, I can select time-based instance. Click on add instance. We'll add another instance. So it will be web server 3, and in the advanced, I'm going to select load based and click on add instance. So now we'll go back to our web server 2, which is a time-based instance. We'll click on configuration, and over here you can configure when you want the instance to be on and when do you want the instance to be shut down. So that's where you can configure your time-based instance. And for load-based instance, you can go to the instance and then click on configuration, click on edit on, and then over here you can configure when you want to scale up or scale down. You can say you want to scale up on when CPU utilization is greater than 80 and scale down when it's less than 30. So that way you can scale your instances. So those are two kinds of instances you can create additionally to the 24/7 instance. So go back to our instances. I can delete it from here if I don't want an instance. And we are waiting for our primary instance to boot. So now the status of our instance is online. I'm going to click on the public IP, and after a while, if you refresh, you will see our web application. So you can also go to your instances, click on the instance, and see the status over here. So it's green, successful, and you can view the logs. So if you see any errors while loading, you can view the logs for the errors. The other thing we can see is the monitoring section, where they have basic monitoring available like CPU utilization, memory utilization. And so this is a simple application that we have deployed. You can make it complex and deploy complex applications. The other thing to mention is there is this apps and deployments. So basically you can imagine like creating an app and then deploying that app into the servers. Instead of us providing the cookbook as a lifecycle event, you could provide the cookbook as an app and then deploy the app. So basically you go to the app section, click on add app, and then over here we could provide the recipe of our cookbook. So I can go and provide the URL and then add an app, and then I can click on deploy to actually deploy the application. So this is just a basic idea of the apps and deployments. So basically in this video we saw how to create a stack, then we saw how to create a layer, and then how to configure our layer. We added a recipe to the layer as a lifecycle event, and then we configured security and like the security group, and then we can also configure the network and all the VPC settings. You can, at the layer level, you can also add additional layers like an RDS layer or multiple web layers. And then we saw different instance types, and then we saw an overview of what are apps and deployments. And now let's go to our console or EC2 console, and you can see over here we have our web server that was created just like Elastic Beanstalk. We can view the resources. And so going back, first if you want to delete our stack, we'll have to stop the instance. So now our instance is stopped. You can delete it over here. So that will terminate our instance. Then you can delete our layer. And then you can go to the stack and then click on delete stack. So as it says, we have an application over here, so we'll have to delete our application. There are no deployments. Now we'll go back to our stack and click on delete stack, and it has deleted our stack as well. So this is how you create a stack layer inside OpsWorks. So in this video, we are going to look at AWS OpsWorks stacks lifecycle events. And we already saw the configure lifecycle event where we had provided our recipe to configure Apache. So each layer has 5 lifecycle events, and you can see them on the screen right now, and each of which has an associated set of recipes that are specific to that layer. So when an event occurs on a layer's instance, AWS OpsWorks stack automatically runs the appropriate set of recipes. And if you want to customize the events, you can implement your own custom recipe. So in our case, we already saw an example of the configure event which we had customized. So those will be run after the inbuilt recipes for that particular event. So the setup event, this event occurs after an instance has finished booting. And you can also manually trigger this event by using setup stack commands. Also, when you run the setup event, or whenever you run a setup recipe, the instance is taken out of load balancer to run the setup commands. The next is the configure event. This event runs on all of the stack instances when one of the following occurs: when an instance enters or leaves an online state, or you associate an elastic IP address with an instance or disassociate it from one of the instances, or you attach an elastic load balancing layer or detach it from your stack. So even if the event occurs on one instance, the configure events is run on all the instances in that stack. So if, let's say, if you stop an instance, AWS OpsWorks will trigger the configure event on other instances as well. The next is the deploy event. This event occurs when you run a deploy command, typically to deploy an application to a set of application server instances. And the instances run recipes that deploy the application and any related files from its repository to the layer's instance. Then we have the undeploy event, and this event occurs when you delete an app or run a undeploy command to remove an app from set of application server instances. And the specified instances run recipes to remove all application versions and perform any required cleanup in the undeploy event. And then you have the shutdown event, and this event occurs after you direct OpsWorks stacks to shut down an instance, but before the associated EC2 instance is actually terminated. And in this event, OpsWorks stack runs recipe to perform cleanup tasks like shutting down services and things like that. So these are the events of a stack's lifecycle, and this is important section, and you may or may not get a question on this on the exam. So it's important to know the events, lifecycle events of OpsWorks stack.